In the year 782, on the banks of the Aller River in Verden, something unthinkable happened. 4,500 men, fathers, brothers, sons, were forced to kneel. What followed was one of the most brutal mass executions in medieval history. The man who ordered it, the same king we celebrate today as the father of Europe. His name was Charlemagne. But here's what they don't tell you in the history books. This massacre wasn't just about religion, it wasn't just about power, it was about something far more complicated, far more human, and far more terrifying. Stay with me, because the truth behind the Massacre of Verden will change everything you thought you knew about the Middle Ages. To understand why Charlemagne would do something so horrific, we need to travel back to a world that no longer exists. Picture northern Germany in the 8th century, no unified nation, no single king, just vast forests, sacred groves, and fiercely independent tribes who answered to no one. These were the Saxons, not a single people, but a collection of tribes spread across 3 main regions: Westphalia in the west, Eastphalia in the east, and Angria in the center. Each region had its own leaders, men called satraps. But here's the crucial part. There was no Saxon king, no central authority, no one person who could speak for all Saxons. They worshipped the old gods, Thor, Woden, sacred trees like the Irminsul, a massive wooden pillar that connected earth to the heavens. To the Saxons, Christianity wasn't just a different religion, it was a threat to their entire way of life, their identity, their freedom. And for generations they had successfully resisted the Franks, Charlemagne's people, who kept trying to conquer them. But when Charlemagne came to power in 768, everything changed, because Charlemagne didn't just want to defeat the Saxons, he wanted to erase them as they were and rebuild them in his image. Here's where things get fascinating and frustrating. The Saxon Wars didn't follow the normal pattern of medieval warfare. Usually you fight a battle, someone wins, someone loses, and it's over. Not with the Saxons. Charlemagne would invade, the Saxons would fight back, they'd lose, then they'd surrender, agree to become Christians, hand over hostages, and everything seemed fine. Charlemagne would march away thinking he'd finally conquered them, and then the moment his back was turned, the Saxons would rebel. Again, and again, and again. They'd attack Frankish fortifications. They'd burn down the churches Charlemagne had built. They'd execute the priests he'd sent. It was a cycle that repeated itself year after year after year for over 3 decades. But why? Why couldn't Charlemagne just conquer them and be done with it? The answer lies in that decentralized structure we talked about. When Charlemagne defeated one group of Saxons and extracted promises from their leaders, it meant nothing to the Saxons in the next valley over. They hadn't agreed to anything. They hadn't been defeated, and they certainly weren't going to bow down to some Frankish king just because their neighbors did. It drove Charlemagne absolutely mad. Here was a man who would become the first emperor of the Romans since the fall of the Western Empire, a man who conquered the Lombards in Italy, pushed back the Muslims in Spain, and united most of Western Europe. But these Saxons, they wouldn't stay conquered. And there was another problem. The new Saxon converts were being taxed heavily, tithes to the church, tribute to Charlemagne. For people who had been free their entire lives, who had governed themselves, this felt like slavery. So when they rebelled, they weren't just rejecting Christianity, they were rejecting occupation, taxation, and foreign domination. By 782, Charlemagne had been fighting the Saxons for 10 years. 10 years of this exhausting cycle, and he thought he'd finally broken them. Many Saxon nobles had converted to Christianity, some genuinely, others because they saw which way the wind was blowing. These nobles were being integrated into Charlemagne's system, receiving lands, titles, and positions of power. It seemed like peace was finally within reach. Then came the revolt of 782, and this one was different. A Saxon war leader named Widukind, who had refused to submit and had fled to Denmark, returned and rallied the tribes. The Saxons rose up across the entire region. They attacked Frankish positions. They slaughtered isolated garrisons. They made it clear that they would rather die free than live as subjects. Charlemagne was in the middle of campaigning against the Slavs on his eastern border when he heard the news. He had to abandon that campaign and rush back to Saxony. And when he arrived, he was furious. Not just angry, absolutely enraged. Because to Charlemagne, this wasn't just a military rebellion. These Saxons had sworn oaths, they had been baptized, they had given hostages. In the Frankish legal system, breaking an oath was one of the worst crimes imaginable. These weren't just rebels, they were oath breakers, traitors, and the penalty for treason was death. So Charlemagne did what he always did with rebels. He crushed the uprising militarily. His army defeated the Saxons in battle, and then he demanded that the rebels be handed over. The sources tell us that 4,500 Saxon prisoners were brought to Verden, a settlement on the banks of the Aller River. And there, in a single day, Charlemagne had them all executed. Now let's pause here because this number, 4,500, is staggering. To put it in perspective, that's more people than died in many medieval battles. It's a number so large that some modern historians have questioned whether it actually happened. Maybe the chroniclers exaggerated, maybe the number was mistranslated, maybe it was 4,500 across multiple events, not in a single day. But here's the thing, even if the number was smaller, even if it was only 1,000 or 2,000, it was still a massacre. It was still a deliberate mass execution ordered by a Christian king against people he claimed he was trying to convert. Think about the logistics for a moment. Executing 4,500 people isn't quick. It isn't easy. This would have taken hours, maybe an entire day. The executioners would have grown tired. The ground would have become slick with blood. The river would have run red. And Charlemagne watched, or at least he gave the order knowing full well what would happen. The Frankish chronicles are remarkably matter-of-fact about it. The royal Frankish annals simply state that 4,500 Saxons were beheaded at Verden. No justification, no attempt to soften it, just a cold, clinical record of mass killing. Other sources are more revealing. They tell us that Charlemagne treated this as a legal execution, not a war crime. These men had broken their oaths. They had rebelled against legitimate authority. Under Frankish law, they had forfeited their right to live. But was it legal? Was it just? Those questions haunted Charlemagne for the rest of his life. You might think that executing 4,500 people would finally break the Saxon resistance, but you'd be wrong. The Saxons kept fighting. Widukind remained at large, rallying more warriors. The cycle of rebellion and repression continued. If anything, Verden made things worse. It transformed the conflict from a political struggle into something personal, something visceral. Even Charlemagne seems to have realized he'd gone too far. In the years after Verden, his approach changed. He became more willing to negotiate, to offer terms, to integrate Saxon nobles into his system rather than simply crushing them. In 785, Widukind himself finally submitted. He was baptized with Charlemagne standing as his godfather. It was a symbolic moment, the great Saxon rebel finally accepting Frankish rule. But was it genuine conversion or pragmatic survival? We'll never know. The Saxon Wars continued until 804, 22 more years after Verden. But the character of the conflict shifted. There was more negotiation, more integration, less mass killing. Charlemagne also offered concessions. He reduced the taxes on Saxon converts. He allowed them to keep more of their traditional practices. He realized that you couldn't simply force an entire people to change their religion and way of life overnight. By the time the wars finally ended, Saxony was integrated into the Carolingian Empire. Saxon nobles served in Charlemagne's court. Saxon warriors fought in his armies. The old pagan religion gradually faded, replaced by Christianity. But it took decades, not days, and it came at an enormous cost in human life. So here's the question that historians have debated for centuries. Was this a holy war? Was Charlemagne trying to spread Christianity through violence? Was the Massacre of Verden an early example of religious genocide? The answer is complicated. Yes, religion was central to the conflict. Charlemagne genuinely believed he was saving Saxon souls by converting them to Christianity. The Pope supported his campaigns. The Frankish bishops blessed his armies. In that sense, it was absolutely a religious war, but it was also a war of conquest. Charlemagne wanted to expand his empire, he wanted to secure his borders, he wanted to extract tribute and taxes from the Saxons. Religion was a tool, a powerful tool for achieving political control. When you baptize someone, you're not just changing their beliefs. You're binding them to a new system of authority. You're making them subject to Christian law, Christian kings, and Christian power structures. The Saxons understood this perfectly. That's why so many of them resisted. They weren't just fighting for their gods. They were fighting for their independence, their way of life, their freedom from foreign domination. And Charlemagne's methods? Mass executions, forced resettlements, destruction of sacred sites. These weren't unique to religious wars. This was how medieval rulers dealt with rebellions. When you rebelled against your king, you faced brutal punishment. The fact that this rebellion also involved religious conversion made it more complicated, but the underlying logic was the same. So was Verden, a massacre driven by religious fanaticism or political necessity. The truth is both. And neither. It was a product of its time, a brutal age when human life was cheap, when religious and political authority were inseparable, and when kings like Charlemagne believed that the ends justified any means. Today, Charlemagne is remembered as the father of Europe. His empire laid the groundwork for medieval Christendom. He's celebrated on coins, in statues, in history books. The European Union even named one of its buildings after him. But Verden reminds us that history is never simple. The same man who promoted learning, who preserved Roman and Christian culture, who unified a fractured continent, was also capable of ordering the execution of thousands of people in a single day. The Massacre of Verden stands as one of the darkest moments of the Middle Ages. It's a reminder that progress often comes at a terrible price, that civilization can be built on mountains of corpses, that the heroes of history are complicated, flawed, and sometimes monstrous. The Saxons eventually became part of Charlemagne's empire, part of Christian Europe, but they never forgot Verden. Even today, over 200 years later, there's a memorial at the site, a reminder of what happened when power, religion, and violence collided on the banks of the Aller River. Was it necessary? Was it justified? Or was it simply evil? I'll let you decide, but one thing is certain. The story of Charlemagne and the Saxons is far more complex than we're usually told. And the Massacre of Verden? It's a chapter of history we should never forget. Now I want to hear from you. Do you think Charlemagne was a visionary leader doing what was necessary to unite Europe? Or was he a brutal conqueror who committed atrocities in the name of religion and power? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this story as fascinating and disturbing as I did, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more untold stories from history that challenge everything you thought you knew. There are so many more dark chapters waiting to be uncovered. And trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.